I killed the engine of my Ford F-150, but I didn't open the door. I just sat there in the cab, the silence of the Colorado winter settling around me like a heavy blanket. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Tired eyes, the faint lines of fatigue etched by a 20-hour flight from Syria. But there was a spark there too. A childish excitement. On the passenger seat sat a limited edition Lego Millennium Falcon set I'd spent a month tracking down for my nephew. 10 steps. That's all that separated me from the front door, the smell of roasted turkey, and the warmth I'd been hallucinating about for 6 months in the desert. Then, the phone in my breast pocket buzzed. Just once. Dry. Mechanical. I smiled, thinking it was Dad rushing me. He always hated cold food. But the smile died the second the screen lit up. A text from Dad. "Paula, I think you shouldn't come in tonight. Evan is here, and your presence, your whole military success vibe, it's going to make him feel insecure. Your mother and I want Evan to have a good night. Please understand. Merry Christmas." My phone slipped from my hand, hitting the rubber floor mat with a thud. The air in the cab seemed to vanish. My chest constricted, a sharp cold pain running down my spine that hurt worse than the shrapnel graze I took last year outside of Aleppo. I looked through the frosted windshield into the brightly lit living room. Dad was raising a glass of wine, a bottle of Camus I'd wired the money for, toasting Evan. My brother, the 45-year-old man-child who had just completed his third rehab stint on my dime. They were laughing, they were warm, and they were happy because I wasn't there. I looked down at the name tape embroidered on my chest. Poole. The name I had spent my entire adult life trying to honor, to protect, to fund. But right now it felt heavy as lead. I wasn't their daughter. I was a contingency plan. A walking ATM. And worse, I was an obstacle to the fragile ego of their golden child. Why did I drive 2 hours through a blizzard to get to a place where I was considered surplus inventory? If this family wasn't my base of operations, what exactly was I fighting for? I didn't hit the gas immediately. My eyes were glued to that window, like I was running surveillance on a high-value target. Evan stood up, clapping Dad on the shoulder, laughing that wheezy laugh of his. And then I saw it. Evan was wearing a jacket. A sandstone duck Carhartt, brand new, stiff and brown. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned the color of bone. That was the jacket I had ordered from Germany, shipped specifically for Dad's birthday last month with a note. "So you stay warm when you go ice fishing." Dad hadn't worn it. He had thrown it to Evan. To them, my love was transferable. My labor was community property to be redistributed to fatten up the failure they coddled. I wasn't just banned from the premises, my gifts were being stripped of their origin. They took the jacket, but they rejected the giver. I restarted the truck. The engine roared to life, sounding like a wounded animal. I didn't knock. I didn't leave the Legos. Tonight, Sergeant First Class Paula Poole was going AWOL from her own family. 15 miles later, I pulled into a Waffle House off I-70. The wind was howling now, whipping snow across the asphalt. Inside, the place was empty, save for a trucker asleep in the back booth. The speakers were playing a tinny, distorted version of Silent Night. I ordered 2 eggs, over easy, and black coffee. The grease in the air clung to my skin, a stark contrast to the expensive roast turkey I knew they were carving back at the house. I pulled out my phone and opened my Wells Fargo app. The balance was high: hazardous duty pay, imminent danger pay, tax-free combat zone exclusion. It adds up when you don't have a life. But I scrolled down to the transaction history. It was a bleeding wound of outgoing funds. Transfer to Frank Poole, $2,000. Payment, Evan's Visa signature, $450. Utility company, $315. I had been living on MREs and sleeping in tents so they could live in comfort. I was the scapegoat, the workhorse, the one they called when the roof leaked, but ignored when the champagne was poured. I took a sip of the coffee. It was scalded and bitter. Perfect. I remembered a quote from David Goggins, a guy whose book got me through Ranger School when everyone said a woman couldn't hack it. You have to callous your mind. You have to build a layer of armor over your feelings so the pain can't dictate your actions. I had calloused my body for the army. Now, I had to callous my heart for my family. I tapped the Scheduled Transfers tab. Monthly transfer to Dad, $2,000. Next transfer, Jan 1st. My finger hovered over the screen. My heart hammered against my ribs, a conditioned response of guilt implanted in me since I was 5 years old. Honor thy father. That's what he always quoted. But he forgot the part about fathers not provoking their children to wrath. I hit cancel. Are you sure? The app asked. Yes. Next. Evan's car insurance. The policy was under my name because his credit score was sub 400. Cancel policy. Next. The utilities for the house I wasn't allowed to enter. Remove payment method. With every tap, a jolt of panic shot through me, followed immediately by a rush of oxygen. It was the feeling of cutting away a parachute that wasn't opening. I wasn't taking revenge. Revenge is emotional. This was tactical. I was simply ceasing to purchase love that was never for sale in the first place. Before we see where this road takes me, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been the fixer in your family? The one they call for money, but never for dinner? The one who gives until you're empty, only to be told you're too much? If you are done being used, I want you to hit that like button right now. And if you're brave enough, comment, cut the line below. Let me know I'm not the only one sitting in a diner alone tonight. You okay, soldier? I looked up. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with tired eyes and a name tag that read, Barb, was refilling my mug. She looked at my red eyes, then at the uniform. She didn't ask stupid questions. She just poured the coffee. I'm solid, ma'am, I lied. Just regrouping. Well, coffee's on the house for the troops. Merry Christmas, honey. She walked away. A stranger at a Waffle House showed me more respect in 30 seconds than my father had in 30 years. I opened my laptop. If Colorado didn't want me, I needed a new area of operations. I didn't want a condo. I didn't want neighbors. I wanted a perimeter. I typed into the search bar. Isolated property, Northern Rockies, cash sale, immediate possession. Zillow spit out a dozen listings, but one caught my eye. It was in Montana. 40 acres of timber and rock, backing up to national forest land. A derelict cabin that looked like it had been punched by a giant and was still standing. The name of the property listing made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Pool Ridge. It was a coincidence, obviously. Pool is a common name. But looking at that snow-covered valley, surrounded by jagged peaks that looked like wolf teeth, I felt a pull. It was desolate. It was freezing. It was broken. Perfect, I whispered. I didn't need a home to host parties. I didn't need a guest room for a brother who would steal my jewelry. I needed a fortress. A place where, if someone wanted to get to me, they'd have to fight their way up a mountain. I clicked Contact Agent. The time for being the good daughter was over. The time for digging in had just begun. Montana didn't welcome me with a warm hug. It greeted me with a slap in the face as the wind howled down through the valley, stripping the heat right out of my bones, the second I stepped out of the truck. It was a dry, biting cold, the kind that finds every seam in your uniform and digs in like a tick. I stood there with my boots crunching on the frozen gravel, looking up at Pool Ridge. The photos online had been generous because in person the cabin looked like a skeleton. The porch sagged on the left side, and the chimney listed slightly to the east, but the foundation was stone, river rock and granite, piled high and thick. It was ugly, scarred, and abandoned, which meant it was exactly like me. Carol, the real estate agent who had driven out from Missoula, was leaning against her pristine SUV while hugging a thick down coat around herself. She looked at my beat-up Ford F-150, with its Colorado plates, then back at the desolate property before blowing a plume of cigarette smoke into the frigid air. She told me the place had been sitting empty for 2 years. The furnace was shot, the septic probably needed pumping, and the fence line was down in 3 places. She warned me that if a blizzard hit, the county plow didn't come this far up and there would be nobody coming to save me out here. I looked back at the house, thinking about the text message from my father and the warm living room I wasn't allowed to enter. I told her I was used to not being saved and that I would take it. We didn't go inside to sign the papers. We used the hood of my truck as a desk, because the engine block was still warm, melting the falling snowflakes as they landed. Carol laid out the purchase agreement with the wind, whipping the corners of the pages, and started explaining that usually they would wait for the bank to process the mortgage application, which could take 30 days. I cut her off and told her there would be no mortgage. I reached into the glove box and pulled out the envelope I had picked up from a Wells Fargo branch in Denver on my way out of town, handing her the cashier's check. Carol took it, and her eyebrows shot up toward her hairline when she saw the number because it was the full amount for a cash sale. It was every dime I had, representing 20 years of savings, re-enlistment bonuses, and hazard pay for defusing IEDs in Syria. That piece of paper represented every time I had been shot at and every night I had slept in the dirt while my brother slept in a bed I paid for. Carol stammered that she just needed to fill out the deed information and pointed to a line at the bottom of the title transfer document for the beneficiary in case of death. I uncapped my pen, and my hand moved automatically from muscle memory because for 20 years, on every SGLI life insurance form and bank account, I had written the name Frank Poole. The tip of the pen touched the paper, and I started to form the letter F, but then I stopped. The ink bled into the paper, forming a tiny dark blot as I saw my father raising that glass of wine and Evan wearing the jacket. If I died out here tonight, Frank would sell this land next week to buy Evan a new truck or pay off a gambling debt. My grip on the pen tightened until the plastic barrel creaked and I crossed out the F with a violent slash. I told Carol to leave it blank. She looked at me for a long second, seeing something in my face that made her decide not to argue, and handed me a heavy brass key that was cold as ice. An hour later, Carol was gone, and the silence she left behind was heavy, broken only by the caw of a raven. I was hauling my green army duffel bags onto the rotting porch when gravel crunched behind me. I didn't flinch. I just set the bag down and turned to see a white SUV with Sheriff emblazoned on the side. Sheriff Walt Hensley stepped out, looking like a man carved out of the granite cliffs surrounding us. He was 60 with a gray mustache and walked with a hitch in his stride, but his hand rested casually near his hip. He didn't smile as he told me he had run my plates and saw that Sergeant First Class Paula Poole with 3 tours in EOD was moving in. He assessed me not as a woman but as a threat level, telling me my record was clean and welcoming me home. He tilted his Stetson back slightly to look up at the dilapidated house and warned me that the dirt had bad history because of bad decisions. He told me Old Man Miller built that foundation himself, but lost his sanctuary because he co-signed a business loan for a nephew in Boise who defaulted. Walt kicked a loose rock with his boot and said Miller shot himself in the barn out back rather than watch the bank auction it off, losing everything because he let family cross the fence line. The wind gusted, rattling the loose shingles on the roof as if the house was groaning in agreement. Walt looked me in the eye and said that in Montana they believe in the Second Amendment and sturdy fences, so I shouldn't let anyone through that gate unless I invited them because law enforcement takes a while to get up here. I told him I preferred it that way, and he drove off, leaving me alone with the ghosts of Old Man Miller. Night fell fast in the mountains, and the cabin had no electricity, so I found some dry wood stacked under a tarp and got a fire roaring in the massive stone hearth. The flames licked at the soot-stained bricks and cast long shadows against the bare log walls while I unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor. The air was still freezing with my breath pluming in front of my face, but the radiant heat from the fire was a small mercy. I sat cross-legged on the sleeping bag and pulled my phone out to see no signal, which meant no texts from Dad and no missed calls from Evan. In their world back in Colorado, they were probably still eating leftovers and drinking the wine I paid for, unaware that the host had just cut them off. I set the phone down and reached into my bag to pull out my Sig Sauer P3 2020. The metal was cold and heavy in my hand, a tool I trusted more than any promise my father had ever made. I checked the empty chamber and grabbed a magazine, seeing the brass casings of the hollow points gleaming in the firelight. I slammed the magazine home, and the sound of the slide racking echoed through the empty house like a lock snapping shut. I placed the gun on the floor right next to my pillow within arm's reach. The silence outside was absolute with no sirens or traffic. Just the wind and the crackle of the fire. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for a text or orders. I was just waiting, and I was ready. The morning sun in Montana didn't provide heat, it only provided illumination, revealing the full extent of the neglect Pool Ridge had suffered. I spent the first 3 hours of daylight working the perimeter, wrestling with a section of barbed wire fence that had collapsed under the weight of last winter's snow. My gloves were thick leather, but my fingers were numb, and every muscle in my back screamed in protest. I liked the pain. It was honest. It was a reminder that I was building something for myself, not digging a latrine in a desert for a mission I didn't understand or paying for a rehab center that wouldn't work. I had just finished restringing a particularly stubborn post near the end of the driveway when I saw the mailbox. It was a rusted, galvanized steel box mounted on a leaning cedar post, half buried in a drift of old, hardened snow. The red flag was down, frozen in place. I kicked the snow away with my boot, intending to straighten the post later, but the door of the box popped open. Inside, jammed into the back, was a frozen brick of mail. It looked like it had been there for years, preserved by the dry cold like artifacts in a museum. I pulled the clump out, intending to toss it into the trash bag I'd strapped to my waist. Most of it was what you'd expect. Faded circulars for grocery stores in Missoula, ads for gutter cleaning, a seed catalog from 2021. But then, sandwiched between a flyer for tractor parts and a disconnect notice from the power company, I saw a thick, white envelope. The return address was Wells Fargo Home Mortgage, stamped with a priority seal. That wasn't unusual for a foreclosed property. What stopped my heart cold was the name in the clear plastic window. It didn't say current resident. It didn't say Old Man Miller. It said Mr. Evan Poole. Underneath his name was the address, 1014 Ridge Road, Pool Ridge. The air in my lungs turned to ice. My hands, already stiff from the cold, began to tremble with a different kind of chill. Why was my brother's name on a piece of mail at a property I had just stumbled upon and bought yesterday? I looked at the postmark. It was dated 2 years ago. I pulled my tactical folding knife from my pocket, the blade snapping open with a sharp click that cut through the silence of the valley. I sliced the top of the envelope open, careful not to damage the contents, treating it like evidence because my gut told me that's exactly what it was. I unfolded the letter. It was a notice of adverse action, a mortgage denial letter. I scanned the lines, my eyes narrowing against the glare of the snow. The reasons listed for the denial were a laundry list of financial failures, delinquent past credit obligations, excessive debt-to-income ratio, credit score below 450. Seeing Evan's credit score in black and white wasn't a surprise. The man treated credit cards like free money vouchers. But it was the handwritten note in red ink in the margin, likely scribbled by a loan officer during a phone consultation, that made bile rise in my throat. Applicant state's father, Frank Poole, guarantees co-signer participation. Co-signer identified as Paula Poole, active duty military. Income verification pending. Need applicant to provide POA or sister's signature. I dropped the knife into the snow and sat down hard on the frozen ground. The world spun slightly. 2 years ago, I was in a forward operating base in Syria, sleeping in body armor, dodging mortar fire, and eating dust. While I was risking my life, my father and brother were here, physically or digitally, trying to buy this exact property. They weren't just looking for a house, they were looking for a host. They intended to use my credit, my military status, and my clean financial record to secure a loan for Evan's dream ranch, likely forging my name or hoping to bully me into signing once the paperwork was drawn up. The coincidence of the name Pool Ridge wasn't a coincidence at all. That's why the listing had caught my eye. Subconsciously, I must have recognized the name from some ramblings of my father years ago. Or maybe it was just fate dragging me to the scene of the crime. They had failed because the bank did its job. They couldn't produce my signature, and they couldn't produce a power of attorney because I had never given them one. I looked up at the house. Yesterday, I thought I had bought a fixer-upper. Today, I realized I had bought a crime scene. This was the prize they had been eyeing. This was supposed to be Evan's kingdom, paid for by Paula's blood money. And yesterday, when I bought it with cash, I didn't just buy a house. I snatched their prey right out of their jaws. That explained the silence. Dad wasn't ignoring me because he was mad I didn't come to dinner. He was silent because he was in shock. He was scrambling. He was calculating how to spin this, how to guilt me, how to take what I had legally purchased and hand it over to the son who deserved it. In military intelligence, we are taught that there are no coincidences, only information that hasn't been decoded yet. The code was broken. I wasn't dealing with a difficult family. I was dealing with predatory identity thieves who shared my DNA. I stood up, brushing the snow off my pants. The sadness I had felt at the Waffle House was gone, replaced by a cold, hard rage. It was a useful anger, the kind that sharpens your vision and steadies your hands. I grabbed the letter and the knife, marching back up the driveway to the cabin. I was done fixing the fence. It was time to fortify the perimeter. I went inside and locked the door, throwing all 3 deadbolts I had lubricated the night before. I opened my laptop, tethering it to my phone's spotty signal. My first stop wasn't a furniture site, it was Amazon. I ordered a 4-camera solar-powered security system with cloud storage and night vision. Next, I ordered 6 heavy-duty aluminum signs. Posted, no trespassing, private property, violators will be prosecuted. Then I added 1 more for the front gate, red and black. Warning, owner is armed. Finally, I picked up my phone. I went to my contact list. I opened Evan's contact. Block caller, block FaceTime, block messages. Then I opened Dad. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I knew if I heard his voice, that booming, authoritative voice that used scripture to manipulate and guilt to control, I might falter, I might scream. Instead, I bypassed the ring and went straight to his voicemail. I waited for the beep, picturing him sitting in his recliner, probably nursing a hangover from the expensive wine I bought. "This is Paula," I said, my voice dropping an octave devoid of any warmth, sounding exactly like the soldier he claimed to be so proud of. "I found the Wells Fargo letter in the mailbox. I know about the loan application. I know you tried to use my name. Don't call me. And do not, under any circumstances, come to my property. If you step foot on this land, I will treat you like any other intruder." I hung up and tossed the phone onto the sleeping bag. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my hands were steady. The supply line was cut. The bridge was burned. Now, all that was left was to hold the line. 3 days of silence had passed since I blocked Evan's number, and for a brief, delusional moment, I thought the war was over. I spent those days fortifying the cabin, installing the solar cameras I ordered, and getting the wood stove to burn efficiently. Because cell service was virtually non-existent up here on the ridge, the local telecom company had come out yesterday to hook up a landline. It was an old-school necessity in the mountains, a copper wire lifeline to the outside world. I hadn't given the number to anyone except the sheriff's office and my father. That was my mistake. I assumed giving it to him was a safety precaution. He saw it as a direct line of fire. The phone rang at 11 p.m. The sound was jarring in the absolute stillness of the cabin, a shrill, mechanical scream that made me jump. I was sitting by the fire, cleaning my Sig Sauer, the smell of gun oil sharp in the air. I stared at the cheap beige handset mounted on the kitchen wall. It rang again, and again, demanding, relentless. I knew exactly who it was. I walked over to the phone, my heart rate spiking not out of fear, but out of a conditioned, Pavlovian dread. I didn't just pick it up. I pressed the small button on the base unit labeled speaker, and then with a shaking finger, I pressed record. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Hello." There was no greeting. No, "Merry Christmas." No, "Are you safe?" "You blocked your brother," the voice on the other end boomed. It was low, resonant, and dripping with authority. The voice that had dictated every major decision of my childhood. "You leave in the middle of the night. You vanish. And now I hear from a credit inquiry that the title for the Pool Ridge property has been transferred to you. Are you punishing this family, Paula?" I gripped the edge of the counter. I'm not punishing anyone. I bought a home. I needed a place to live. Live? Frank laughed, a dry, humorless sound. All alone up there in the wilderness, while your brother is battling severe depression in a cramped apartment? You know he had his heart set on that land. You knew it, and you bought it out from under him like a thief in the night. I bought it with my money, Dad. Money I earned while getting shot at. Evan doesn't have a job, let alone a down payment. Money. He spat the word like it was a curse. Is that all you care about? What happened to your values? The Bible says in 1 Timothy 5:8, "But if any provide not for his own, and specially for those of his own house, he has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel." You are acting worse than an unbeliever, Paula. You are hoarding God's blessings while your own flesh and blood suffers. That is the behavior of a viper. The scripture hung in the air like toxic smoke. He was weaponizing my faith, twisting the words of the Apostle Paul to justify his son's entitlement. My knuckles turned white. Evan isn't suffering, Dad. He's suffering from a lack of consequences because you keep shielding him. There was a pause on the line. I could hear him breathing, recalibrating his tactics. When he spoke again, the anger was gone, replaced by a smooth, sickening sweetness. This was the gaslighting. This was the trap. Look, Paula, I know you're independent. I'm proud of that, he lied. But you have to understand, Evan needs a win. He needs a foundation to rebuild his life. He wants to start a business, maybe run a ranch. He can't get a loan without collateral. You have your military pension. You have your career. You don't need the equity in that land. I felt the blood drain from my face. What are you asking me? I'm asking you to be a decent sister, he purred. Put Evan's name on the deed. Just add him as a co-owner. That's all. It gives him the assets he needs to secure a business loan. It costs you nothing, but it saves his life. Be the hero, Paula. Like you are in the army. The audacity was so staggering it almost knocked the wind out of me. He didn't want the house for Evan to live in. He wanted Evan's name on the deed so they could leverage the property, my property, to take out massive loans. They wanted to strip the equity out of my home to fund Evan's gambling or business ventures, and when he inevitably defaulted, the bank would take my house. They wanted to use my sweat and blood as their collateral. So you want me to be a co-signer without signing the loan, I said, my voice trembling with rage. You want to use my house as an ATM for Evan. I want you to help your family. Frank's voice rose again, the mask slipping. Don't be selfish. No, I said. The word fired out of me like a bullet. Excuse me? I said no. I will not put his name on the deed. I will not give you a dime. I will not be your collateral anymore. You listen to me, young lady. No, you listen. I know about the loan application from 2 years ago. I found the letter. I know you tried to use my name behind my back. That is fraud, Dad. And if you call me again asking for money, or if you send Evan up here, I will change this number and I will call the authorities. You wouldn't dare. I didn't let him finish. I slammed the receiver back onto the cradle with enough force to crack the plastic casing. The loud clack echoed through the empty cabin, followed by immediate, ringing silence. I stood there, gasping for air as if I had just run a marathon. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't unclench them from the counter. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and stinging. I wasn't crying because I missed him. I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because I had just murdered the good daughter inside of me. She was dead. I had killed the part of me that desperately wanted his approval, the part that would have signed that deed just to hear him say, "Good job, honey." It took me 42 years to say that one little word, no. It is the hardest word to say to the people who raised you, even when they are destroying you. If you have ever had to draw a line in the sand with a toxic parent, or if you're struggling to find the courage to do it right now, I want you to hit that like button. It's a signal to everyone else that they aren't alone. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to say no to save yourself? I looked at the phone. The red light on the recorder was still blinking. I reached out and pressed stop. I had the recording. I had the letter. I had the text messages. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a witness building a case. and I had a feeling that Frank Poole wasn't the type of man who took no for an answer. He wouldn't stop at a phone call. The silence on the other end of the line before I hung up wasn't defeat. It was the calm before a counterattack. I walked over to the door and checked the deadbolt again. Then I went back to the fire, picked up my gun, and resumed cleaning it. The phone didn't ring again that night, but the silence was louder than any scream. 2 days after the phone call, the war moved from the digital world to the physical one. The notification came at 2:14 a.m. My phone, resting on the nightstand next to my Sig Sauer, lit up the dark room with a harsh white glow. A single ping broke the silence. Motion detected. Front gate. I didn't roll over and groan. I didn't wonder if it was a deer. I sat up, adrenaline flooding my system instantly, and grabbed the iPad I kept charged by the bed. I tapped the notification, bringing up the live feed from the solar-powered cameras I had mounted on the pines flanking the driveway. The image was grainy, black and white infrared, ghost-like in its quality. But the subject was unmistakable. A white cargo van was parked on the county road, about 50 yards back from my gate. The headlights were off. The engine was idling. I could see the white plumes of exhaust puffing rhythmically into the freezing night air. 2 figures were walking along the perimeter of my fence line. Even in the pixelated distortion of night vision, I knew them. The first figure walked with a distinctive hitch in his step, favoring his right hip, a souvenir from a construction accident 20 years ago. My father. The second figure was pacing nervously, kicking at the snow. His posture slumped in a way that screamed resentment. Evan. They had driven 10 hours through the winter passes from Colorado. They hadn't come to knock on the door. They hadn't come to talk. They were creeping along the wire like coyotes looking for a gap in the henhouse. They were running reconnaissance. I watched them for 10 minutes. Dad shone a flashlight on the padlock I'd secured the gate with, shaking it violently. It held. He said something to Evan, pointed up toward the cabin, toward me, and then they retreated to the van. They didn't leave, they just parked there, watching. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the dark with my back against the wall, weapon in my lap, watching the screen until the sun came up and the white van finally drove away. The physical threat had retreated, but the psychological flank attack arrived with the morning coffee. At 8 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text message. It wasn't from Dad or Evan. It was from Linda, my stepmother. For a second, a foolish, childish part of me hoped she was checking in on me. Linda had always been the peacemaker, the one who whispered apologies to me after Dad's rages. I opened the message. There was no greeting, just a photo. It was a picture of Evan. He was sitting on the floor of what looked like a Motel 6 room, his head buried in his hands, surrounded by empty mini bottles of liquor. He looked broken. He looked pathetic. Underneath the photo was a wall of text from Linda. Paula, please, look at your brother. He's falling apart. He told us last night he has nothing left to live for if he doesn't get that land. He's talking about ending it all. Your father is beside himself with worry. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but is a piece of dirt worth your brother's life? You've always been the strong one. You can handle the loss. He can't. Please, for me, just give in this one time. Be the bigger person. I stared at the screen, my grip tightening until the phone creaked. Be the bigger person. You're the strong one. Those were the phrases that had defined my abuse for 2 decades. Linda wasn't a peacemaker. She was an enabler. She was a human shield who used me to absorb the blows so she could keep her own life comfortable. When Evan stole my tuition money, she told me to forgive him because he's troubled. When Dad screamed at me for hours, she told me to apologize just to keep the peace. She wasn't asking me to save Evan. She was asking me to sacrifice myself again so she wouldn't have to deal with the fallout of their parenting failures. She was weaponizing his threat of suicide to force me into submission. It was the ultimate emotional blackmail. I felt a wave of nausea, followed by a clarifying flash of anger. I set the coffee mug down. I wasn't going to play the role of the savior anymore. I wasn't going to rush in with my checkbook to save Evan from a crisis he created. I typed my reply. I kept it cold, clinical, and devoid of the emotion she was trying to wring out of me. If Evan is threatening suicide, that is a medical emergency. Call 911 immediately and have them do a welfare check. Do not call me. I am not a suicide hotline, and I am not a bank. I hit send. Then I blocked her number too. I threw the phone onto the couch. The silence in the cabin felt different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy with anticipation. They were here. They were desperate. And now that I had refused the emotional bait, the escalation was inevitable. I put on my boots and my jacket. I needed to go to town. Not to run, but to reinforce. I drove the 15 miles into town, my eyes scanning every passing vehicle for a white van. I pulled into the local hardware store, a place that smelled of sawdust and oil. I didn't browse. I went straight to the aisle with the heavy-duty security equipment. I grabbed 10 feet of the thickest hardened steel chain they had, the kind you use for logging. I grabbed 2 master locks, the heavy weatherproof Magnum series that resisted bolt cutters. Then I went to the signage aisle. I bypassed the polite, private property signs. I grabbed the bright orange and black metal rectangle that stated the law of the land in Montana. Posted. Private property. No trespassing. Violators will be shot. I paid cash. The cashier, a young guy in a flannel shirt, weighed the chain in his hands. Locking up something big? Keeping something out, I said. When I got back to the property, I wrapped the new chain around the gate and the main post, securing it with the massive lock. I bolted the new sign to the center of the gate, eye level. It was a declaration of war. As I was tightening the last bolt, a white SUV slowed down on the road. Sheriff Walt Hensley rolled down his window. He looked at the sign, then at the chain, then at me. White van? He asked. White van, I confirmed. Came by at 2 a.m. 2 males, pacing the line. Walt nodded slowly, his face grim. They're testing the perimeter, checking for weaknesses, typical behavior before a breach. He tipped his hat, his eyes hard as flint. Keep that gate locked, Sergeant. In Montana, the law is on the side of the person inside the fence. Once they cross that line, the rules change. I know, I said, patting the pocket where my cig rested. I'm counting on it. He drove off, continuing his patrol. I stood there for a moment, looking down the empty road where the snow was beginning to drift again. They were out there, watching, waiting, and now, so was I. The attack didn't start with a knock. It started with the scream of metal being tortured. I was asleep, drifting in that light, restless doze common to anyone who has spent time in a combat zone. My hand was resting on the grip of the Sig Sauer P320 Stasi on my chest, a habit I hadn't been able to break since returning from Syria. At 5:15 a.m., the silence of the valley was shattered by the high-pitched, grinding whine of a power tool. I didn't jolt awake. I transitioned instantly from sleep to combat readiness. I rolled off the mattress, keeping low, and grabbed the iPad. The notification banner was red. Audio event detected. Front gate. I tapped the screen. The high-definition night vision camera mounted on the pine tree flickered to life. The scene was grainy and washed out in shades of gray, but the players were distinct. There were 4 of them. Standing at the gate, shivering in a thin coat, was my stepmother, Linda. Next to her, stomping his feet to stay warm, was Evan. And directing the operation, pointing a flashlight at my heavy-duty master lock, was my father. But it was the 4th man who made my blood run cold. He was wearing coveralls and holding a yellow and black DeWalt cordless angle grinder. Sparks were flying in an arc as he pressed the spinning disc against the hardened steel shackle of the lock I had installed just yesterday. They weren't visiting. They were breaching. I tapped the icon for the 2-way audio, muting my side so I could listen in. The grinding noise stopped abruptly. The locksmith pulled the tool back, looking at the sign I'd bolted to the gate. "Look, Mr. Poole," the locksmith said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "I don't know about this. That sign says, 'Violators will be shot.' And this chain, this isn't a standard residential lock. This is heavy duty. You sure she's expecting us?" Frank stepped into the frame. He put a hand on the locksmith's shoulder, his face twisting into a mask of paternal concern that was so convincing it made my stomach turn. "Son, I told you," Frank said, his voice trembling with fake emotion. "My daughter. She just got back from the Middle East. She's not well." He tapped his temple significantly. "Severe PTSD, paranoia. She thinks the enemy is everywhere. She's locked herself in there and hasn't answered her phone in days. We're terrified she's going to hurt herself." Linda chimed in, her voice shrill and shaky. "We just want to make sure she's alive. Please." Frank pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "I have a medical power of attorney right here. I am her legal guardian when she has these episodes. I need you to cut that lock so I can get my little girl the help she needs before she does something tragic." I stared at the screen, my vision tunneling. It wasn't enough to try to steal my property. Now, he was stealing my mind. He was using my service, my sacrifice, and the very real stigma of veteran mental health to paint me as incompetent. He was manufacturing a crisis to legally bypass the no trespassing sign. If the locksmith believed him, if they got through that gate under the guise of a wellness check, Frank could have me committed for a 72-hour psychiatric hold and take control of the property while I was locked away. It was the most vile, calculated move I had ever seen. And it was being executed by my own father. I didn't run out the door screaming. That's what a crazy person would do. Instead, I operated with cold, tactical precision. I minimized the camera app and opened the dialer. I typed 911. 911, what is your emergency? "This is Sergeant First Class Paula Poole," I said, my voice steady, devoid of panic. "I am the homeowner at 1014 Ridge Road. I have 4 individuals attempting to forcibly breach my perimeter gate with power tools. I am alone inside the residence. I am armed." "Ma'am," the dispatcher's voice sharpened instantly. "Are you in immediate danger?" "They are cutting the lock now. I am declaring this a home invasion. I am requesting immediate sheriff assistance. And dispatch, be advised. One of the subjects is claiming to be my father. He's lying about my mental state to gain entry. I am lucid, compliant, and defending my property." "Officers are dispatched, ma'am. Sheriff Hensley is en route. Do not engage unless necessary." "Understood." I kept the line open but set the phone down. The locksmith, seemingly reassured by Frank's lie, revved the grinder again. The sparks flew. They were seconds away from cutting the chain. I needed to buy time, and I needed to make a statement. I opened the control app for the property's irrigation system. The previous owner had installed high-pressure agricultural sprinklers along the fence line for fire suppression during the dry season. The nozzles were aimed directly at the driveway to soak the ground and prevent wildfires from jumping the road. I checked the outside temperature gauge. It was 35 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees above freezing. I selected Zone 1, front gate. I cranked the pressure setting to maximum. "Let's see how much you care about my well-being now, Dad," I whispered. I hit activate. Thwack hisses! The sound of the pressurized water hitting the pipes was like a cannon shot. Outside, 3 high-output impact sprinklers popped up from the snow-covered brush flanking the gate. A split second later, a deluge of freezing water pressurized to 80 psi blasted across the driveway. It was chaos. The stream hit the locksmith first. He dropped the grinder as the icy water slammed into his back, shouting in shock. Then the oscillating head turned, sweeping the jet of liquid ice directly across Frank, Evan, and Linda. Frank roared, throwing his hands up as if warding off a physical blow. The water soaked his expensive wool coat instantly, chilling him to the bone. Evan tried to run back to the van, but he slipped on the icy slush that was forming instantly under his feet. He went down hard, flailing in the mud and snow like a fish on a dock. Linda just stood there, screaming, her hands covering her face. They were drenched. They were freezing. And the breach had stopped cold. I walked over to the corner of the living room where the previous owner had left a PA system microphone connected to a loudspeaker on the utility pole. Another relic for scaring off bears or trespassers. I flipped the switch. The feedback squeal cut through the morning air, louder than the grinder had been. I looked at the monitor. They were scrambling, trying to retreat to the van, slipping and sliding in the deluge. I brought the mic to my lips. My voice boomed across the valley, amplified, distorted, and terrifyingly calm. It sounded like the voice of judgment itself. Leave! Now! Frank froze, looking up at the house, water dripping from his nose. The police are en route, I announced, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. I do not have PTSD, I am not insane, but I am very, very angry. The locksmith didn't wait for permission. He grabbed his wet grinder and sprinted for his truck, leaving my family shivering in the mud. I watched Frank stare at the house one last time. The mask was gone. There was no concern on his face, only the twisted, ugly rage of a predator who had just walked into a trap. I turned off the sprinklers. The silence returned, broken only by the sound of approaching sirens wailing in the distance. The raid was over. The siege was about to begin. The cavalry didn't ride horses. They drove Dodge Chargers with light bars that sliced through the pre-dawn gloom like lasers. 3 sheriff's department cruisers skidded to a halt at the base of my driveway, their red and blue strobes turning the snowy landscape into a disorienting, strobing nightmare. The sirens cut out abruptly, replaced by the crackle of a loudspeaker and the heavy thud of boots hitting the frozen ground. Sheriff Walt Hensley was the first one out, moving with a speed that belied his age. He didn't draw his weapon, but his hand hovered over the grip, his stance wide and commanding. 2 deputies flanked him, their hands resting on their holsters. The scene they walked into was pathetic. My father, Evan, and Linda were huddled together near the white van, drenched from head to toe in freezing water, shivering violently as the Montana wind turned their wet clothes into icy straitjackets. The locksmith, realizing he had been played, had already thrown his DeWalt grinder into the snow and was standing with his hands high in the air, terrified. "Sheriff's Department," Walt's voice boomed, cutting through the wind. "Everybody stay right where you are. Let me see your hands. Now!" The locksmith started babbling immediately, desperate to distance himself from the disaster. "I didn't know. I'm just the contractor. This guy told me it was a medical emergency. He told me the lady inside was crazy." I watched from the window for a split second longer, checking my reflection in the dark glass. I wasn't the scared little girl hiding in her room anymore. I wasn't the ATM machine. I straightened my collar. I checked the placement of my ribbons. I adjusted the holster on my hip. Then, I unlocked the deadbolt. I stepped out onto the porch. The effect was instantaneous. Frank, who had been trying to stammer an explanation to a deputy, looked up and froze. He had painted a picture to the locksmith of a disheveled, mentally unstable recluse living in squalor. What stepped out of that door was the United States Army. I was wearing my full operational camouflage pattern uniform, freshly pressed. My boots were polished to a mirror shine. On my chest, the Combat Action Badge and my Master EOD badge caught the strobe lights. On my collar, the chevrons of a Sergeant First Class demanded respect. And on my hip, legally open-carried, was my Sig Sauer. I didn't look crazy. I looked like I was about to inspect the troops. I walked down the steps, my boots crunching rhythmically on the snow. I ignored my family completely. I walked straight to Sheriff Hensley and snapped a sharp, crisp salute. "Good morning, Sheriff," I said, my voice steady and projecting clearly over the wind. "I am Sergeant First Class Paula Poole. I am the legal owner of this property. These individuals were attempting a forcible entry after being explicitly warned to stay away." Walt returned the salute, a ghost of a smile touching his mustache. "Morning, Sergeant. We got a call about a disturbance." Frank found his voice then. He stepped forward, water dripping from his nose, his expensive wool coat ruined. He looked small. He looked like a wet rat trying to bark at a tank. "Walt." "Sheriff." "You have to listen to me. She's not well." "Look at her. Who wears a uniform at 6 in the morning? She's having an episode. I have a medical power of attorney. I demand you take her into custody for a psychiatric evaluation." He was doubling down. He was so used to his reality being the only one that mattered that he couldn't see the walls closing in. "That's a lie," I said calmly. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was already connected to a video call. I turned the screen so Frank, the sheriff, and the deputies could see it. On the screen was a woman in an army dress uniform, sitting in an office with an American flag behind her. "This is Captain Rachel Levine, Judge Advocate General's Corps," I announced. "She is my legal counsel." Rachel's voice came through the speakerphone, sharp as a razor blade. "Mr. Frank Poole, let me be crystal clear. I have reviewed Sergeant Poole's medical records. She has a clean bill of mental health. No history of psychosis, no court-ordered guardianship. You do not hold power of attorney. What you do hold is a potential indictment for stolen valor by proxy, filing a false police report, and attempted identity theft." Frank's mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. The scripture he loved to quote had deserted him. He couldn't quote Timothy to a JAG officer. He couldn't gaslight the federal government. "Furthermore," Rachel continued, her voice echoing in the cold air, "Sergeant Poole is an active duty service member on leave. Harassing her, attempting to seize her property through fraud, and defaming her character to local law enforcement are federal offenses. If you do not vacate these premises immediately, I will personally ensure the U.S. Attorney's Office takes an interest in your finances." The color drained from Frank's face, leaving it a pasty gray. Evan was cowering behind the van. Linda was sobbing into her hands. The locksmith was shaking his head in disgust. You ungrateful!" Frank sputtered, his entire world crumbling. The narrative he had built for 40 years, that he was the patriarch, the ruler, the god of his tiny kingdom, was shattered. He looked at me, and he didn't see a victim. He saw a mirror reflecting his own failure. And then, he snapped. It was the narcissistic rage, the explosive reaction when a manipulator loses total control. "It's my house," he screamed, his veins bulging in his neck. "I am your father. You owe me. You owe me everything." He lunged. He charged across the snow, fist raised, aiming for my face. It was a clumsy, desperate attack. I didn't flinch. I didn't even reach for my weapon. I just watched him come, calculating the distance. But I didn't have to fight. "Hey!" Walt roared. Before Frank could get within 5 feet of me, Sheriff Hensley hit him like a freight train. It was a textbook takedown. Walt slammed into Frank's midsection, driving him hard into the slush. Frank hit the ground with a sickening thud, the air leaving his lungs in a wheeze. "Stay down!" Walt barked, jamming his knee into Frank's back. "Frank Poole, you are under arrest for trespassing, attempted burglary, and assaulting a federal employee. Give me your hands." The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the valley. I stood there, motionless, looking down at the man who had terrified me for my entire childhood. He was face down in the mud, water soaking into his gray hair, his hands bound behind his back. He wasn't a giant. He wasn't a monster. He was just a pathetic, greedy old man who had overplayed his hand. Evan didn't move to help him. Linda didn't scream. They just watched, paralyzed by the collapse of their leader. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't joy. It wasn't happiness. It was lighter than that. It was the sudden, overwhelming absence of weight. The burden I had carried since I was 5 years old. The need to please him, the fear of his anger, the desperate hope for his love. It all just evaporated into the cold morning air. I looked at Walt as he hauled my father to his feet. "Thank you, Sheriff," I said. "I'd like to press charges. All of them." "Copy that, Sergeant," Walt said, dragging a sputtering Frank toward the cruiser. "We'll take care of the trash." I turned my back on them and walked back into my house. My fortress. My home. For the first time in my life, I didn't look back. The interrogation room at the county sheriff's station smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, a scent that does nothing to mask the odor of fear. I stood in the observation booth, the lights dimmed low, watching the scene unfold through the one-way mirror. It was like watching a silent film of a tragedy I'd written, but never wanted to see produced. Inside the starkly lit room, my brother Evan was slumped over a metal table, sobbing into his hands. His shoulders heaved with the pathetic, hiccuping cries of a child who has finally broken a toy he can't fix. My father sat next to him, but he wasn't offering comfort. Frank Poole was staring at the cinder block wall, his face gray and slack, stripped of the arrogance that had been his armor for 40 years. He looked smaller, deflated, like a balloon that had been pierced by a needle. The heavy steel door behind me opened, and Sheriff Walt Hensley stepped in. He held a thick manila folder in his hands. He didn't look like a man who had just made a big arrest. He looked like a man who had just uncovered a mass grave. "You need to see this, Paula," Walt said, his voice low and grave. He tossed the file onto the narrow desk in front of me. "It's not just greed. I mean, they are greedy, don't get me wrong. But this is survival. They didn't come up here just to steal your equity. They came up here because they are running for their lives." I opened the file. It was a forensic accounting of a disaster. Bank statements, credit card bills, and printouts from online gambling platforms. "Evan has been bleeding money for 3 years," Walt explained, pointing to a column of red ink. "Started with the sports betting apps, DraftKings, FanDuel. He lost his savings betting on NFL spreads. Then he maxed out his credit cards chasing the losses. When the banks cut him off, he didn't stop. He went to Vegas." I turned the page and felt a chill go through me that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. "He went to a loan shark," I whispered, looking at the photocopies of threatening text messages Walt's team had pulled from Evan's phone. "Not just a loan shark," Walt corrected. "Organized crime. He owes $150,000. The vigorous interest alone is $5,000 a week. He hasn't paid in 2 months." $150,000, I repeated, the number feeling alien in my mouth. "They gave him a deadline," Walt said. "New Year's Eve. If he doesn't pay the principal by the time the ball drops, they told him they were going to liquidate the asset." "Meaning Evan." I looked through the glass at my brother. He wasn't crying because he was sorry for breaking into my house. He was crying because he was a dead man walking. But the next words out of Walt's mouth stopped my heart completely. "Here is the part that makes me sick, Paula," Walt said, his voice hardening. "We found messages between your father and the collectors. When the sharks threatened to hurt Evan, Frank tried to make a deal. He told them he had a solution. He told them he had a property in Montana that was worth enough to cover the debt." I gripped the edge of the desk. "He told them about Pool Ridge?" "He did more than that," Walt said, looking at me with genuine pity. "He gave them your address. He told these violent criminals that his daughter, a military veteran with deep pockets, was holding the property as a straw buyer for the family. He promised them that if they waited until after Christmas, he would have the deeds signed over to them. He explicitly told them, 'Go to Pool Ridge. My daughter is there. She'll sign. She does what she's told.'" The room spun. I had to lean back against the wall to keep my knees from buckling. My father hadn't just tried to steal my house. He had painted a target on my back. He had sent professional killers to my doorstep, armed with my address and the belief that I was the only thing standing between them and their money. If I had opened that gate, if the sharks had arrived before the police, Frank was banking on the fact that I would sign the deed to save myself from a beating, or worse. He was willing to feed me to the wolves to save his golden child. I wasn't a daughter to him. I was a human shield. I was the sacrificial lamb he was offering up to the gods of the underworld to buy Evan a second chance. "He sold me out," I whispered. "He sold my safety to save Evan." "He did," Walt confirmed. "That's why he was so desperate to get in. He needed that deed signed before the collectors showed up." I looked at Frank again. I didn't see a father. I saw a monster, a coward who would throw his own child into a fire to keep himself warm. "I'm done," I said. "Processing." I walked out of the booth and into the fluorescent-lit hallway. I needed air. I needed to scrub my skin. But as I turned the corner toward the exit, I saw Linda. She had been released pending charges since she hadn't physically touched the gate or the lock. She was sitting on a bench, looking frail and old. When she saw me, she scrambled up, her eyes red and swollen. "Paula!" She rushed toward me, reaching out with trembling hands. "Paula, wait!" I stopped, but I didn't step toward her. She grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong, desperate. "I'm so sorry," she wept, the tears streaming down her face. I knew it was wrong. I told Frank it was wrong, but he said they were going to kill Evan. He said it was the only way." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading for understanding, for that familiar absolution I had given her 1,000 times before. You have to understand, she sobbed. Evan is my son, my flesh and blood. I couldn't let him die. And you? Paula, you're so strong. You're a survivor. You can handle anything. We knew you could make more money. We knew you'd be okay eventually. But Evan, he would break. Please, tell the sheriff to drop the charges. Don't let them go to prison. The words hung in the air between us, toxic and clarifying. You're so strong. You can handle it. It was the mantra of the abuser's accomplice. Because I was capable, because I was resilient, my suffering was deemed acceptable. My pain was a manageable cost in their equation, while Evan's comfort was a non-negotiable necessity. She wasn't apologizing for the betrayal. She was apologizing that the betrayal hadn't worked. She was admitting that she was willing to watch me be financially ruined and physically threatened by mobsters because she valued Evan's life infinitely more than mine. I looked at her hands clutching mine. They felt like the claws of a parasite. I ripped my hand away. The motion was violent, sharp, final. Don't touch me, I said. My voice was unrecognizable. It was the voice of the Montana winter, 0 degrees and lethal. Linda recoiled, gasping as if I had slapped her. I turned to Captain Rachel Levine, who was still on the video call on my phone, watching silently. Rachel, I said, I want a permanent restraining order for Frank, for Evan, and for Linda. Understood, Rachel replied. We'll file for emergency protection immediately. I looked at Sheriff Hensley. I want them nowhere near me. Not within 10 miles. If they step foot on my road, I want them arrested. If they call me, I want them arrested. And if any collectors show up at my house looking for Frank Poole's money, I will defend my home with lethal force, and their blood will be on Frank's hands. I'll have the judge sign the order within the hour, Walt promised. I looked at Linda one last time through the glass of the station doors. I didn't see my stepmother. I didn't see family. I saw a stranger who had tried to pick my bones clean. You're right, Linda, I said, though she couldn't hear me through the glass. I am strong enough to cut you out like the cancer you are. I pushed the doors open and walked out into the cold, clean air. I was alone, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't lonely. I was free. 2 weeks had passed since the raid. The snow on Poole Ridge had settled into a hard, crusty layer of white that crunched loudly underfoot, a natural alarm system for anyone foolish enough to approach. The valley was quiet again. Frank was gone, extradited back to Colorado to await trial for fraud and assault. Linda had gone with him, posting his bond and likely apologizing to him the entire drive home. But Evan hadn't gone back. I was out by the woodpile, splitting logs for the evening fire, when I saw him. He didn't come in a car. He didn't come with a moving van or a lawyer. He was walking up the center of the county road, a solitary, stumbling figure against the gray backdrop of the mountains. He wore a thin jacket that looked like he'd bought it at a Goodwill, and he carried a battered canvas backpack. He looked 20 years older than he had just 2 weeks ago. I put down the axe and walked to the gate. I didn't unlock it. I stood on the inside, behind the heavy chain and the violators will be shot sign, and waited. Evan stopped 5 feet from the fence. He didn't look at me. He looked at his boots, which were soaked through. He was shivering, his face gaunt, covered in patchy stubble. He looked like a ghost that had forgotten how to haunt. You won, Paula, he said. His voice was raspy, stripped of the arrogance and entitlement that usually defined him. The creditors found me. They know I don't have the deed. They know Dad is useless now. I'm done. He looked up then, and his eyes were hollow. I'm either going to prison or I'm going into a ditch. I wanted to come and say it. You won. I gripped the cold steel of the chain-link fence. It wasn't a game, Evan. It was my life. I know, he whispered. Why? I asked. It was the question that had been burning a hole in my gut since I found the loan application. Why did you do it? Dad, I get. He's a narcissist. He needs control. But you? I paid your rent. I bought your cars. I bailed you out. Why did you want to steal the only thing I had for myself? Evan let out a laugh that sounded more like a cough. He leaned against the fence post, sliding down until he was sitting in the snow. Because you were everything I wasn't, and Dad never let me forget it. I frowned. What are you talking about? You were the golden child. He worshipped the ground you walked on. I was the scapegoat. To your face, maybe, Evan said, looking at the sky. But behind your back? When it was just me and him? God, Paula, he tore me apart. Why can't you be like your sister? Paula is a sergeant. Paula has savings. Paula is a winner. You're a leech, Evan. You're pathetic. He looked at me through the wire mesh. He played us. He told you I was the prince so you'd feel inferior and work harder to buy his love. And he told me I was garbage compared to you, so I'd stay dependent on him. I hated you because you were perfect. I wanted this house, not just for the money. I wanted to own something you built. I wanted to prove I could take something from the winner. The revelation hit me harder than the cold wind. It was classic triangulation. Frank hadn't loved Evan. He had used Evan's failures to torment me, and he had used my success to torture Evan. We were both just puppets in his theater. Evan wasn't the monster. He was just a broken product of the same factory. I'm sorry, Evan said, his voice cracking. I really am. He wiped his nose on his sleeve and looked at me with that familiar, desperate glint in his eye, the look of an addict looking for a fix. Paula, look. I know I don't deserve it, but I need to get out of the state. Tonight? Can you loan me $5,000? Just to get to Canada? I swear I'll never ask you for another dime. My heart constricted. The old reflex kicked in. The savior complex. It would be so easy. I had the money in the safe. I could write a check, hand it through the fence, and make the problem go away. I could save him one last time. Then I remembered the image of my father in handcuffs. I remembered the feeling of being sold out to loan sharks. I remembered the philosophy of Dave Ramsey that I had listened to on the drive up here. You cannot help a drowning man by letting him pull you under. Giving him money wasn't helping him. It was funding his destruction. It was paying for the shovel he would use to dig his own grave. I took a deep breath. The air was sharp in my lungs. No, Evan. He flinched. Paula, please, they're going to kill me. No, I repeated, my voice steady. I will not give you a single cent. My money has been killing you for 20 years. It made you weak. It made you think there were no consequences. If I give you $5,000, you won't go to Canada. You'll go to the nearest casino or dealer, and you'll be dead in a week. I love you too much to pay for your suicide. Evan slumped, burying his face in his hands. He began to sob, ugly, racking sobs of a man who has hit rock bottom. I reached into my pocket. I didn't pull out a checkbook. I pulled out a folded piece of paper. Get up, Evan, I ordered. It was my sergeant voice. He looked up, wiping his eyes. I slid the paper through one of the diamond-shaped gaps in the chain link. He reached out and took it with trembling fingers. That is not a check, I said. That is the address for the Bitterroot Recovery Center in the next county. It's a state-funded facility with a mandatory work program. They have a bed open. They are expecting you. He stared at the paper. And underneath that, I continued, is the number for a public defender. I have retained him. His fees are paid. He's working on a deal with the prosecutor to keep you in rehab and out of prison. And he's communicating with the police about the threats on your life. If you go to that rehab, you are safe. The sharks can't touch you inside. Evan looked at the paper, then back at me. You paid for a lawyer? I paid for your defense, not your escape, I said. You have to walk there. You have to check yourself in. You have to do the work. I can't do it for you. This is the only help you will ever get from me again. He held the paper like it was a holy relic. For the first time in his life, he wasn't being given a handout. He was being given a ladder. It was up to him to climb it. Thank you, he whispered. Don't thank me, I said. Just go. He stood up. He looked at the warm cabin behind me, then at the long, cold road ahead of him. He nodded once, a gesture of respect I had never seen from him before. He turned and started walking south, toward the town, toward the rehab center. I watched him go until he was just a speck in the distance. I didn't open the gate. I didn't call him back to give him a ride. It was tough love, and it tasted bitter. But I knew it was the only thing that could save him. I had rebuilt my fortress, but today I'd built a bridge. Not back to the past, but to a future where we might, just might, survive as individuals. Montana keeps time differently than the rest of the world. It doesn't measure the passing of seasons by the calendar, but by the thaw. It took 4 months for the winter to finally release its grip on Pool Ridge. The snow that had once been a prison of white ice had retreated up the granite peaks, leaving behind a valley that was exploding with life. The silence that used to be menacing was now filled with the sound of snowmelt rushing through the creek and the chirping of mountain bluebirds reclaiming their territory. I stood by the front gate, a paintbrush in my hand. The heavy-duty logging chain was gone. The aggressive "Violators will be shot" sign had been taken down and stored in the shed, replaced by a simple wooden address plaque. I was painting the fence posts a crisp, clean white. I wasn't reinforcing the perimeter against an enemy anymore. I was dressing it up for guests. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles, but underneath that, drifting from the open windows of the cabin, was a scent that made my stomach rumble in anticipation. It was the smell of a honey-glazed ham roasting in the oven, studded with cloves and basting in its own sweet juices. It was the smell of Easter. For the first time since I drove up that treacherous road in December, this place didn't smell like a bunker. It smelled like a home. A familiar rumble drew my attention to the road. A dusty Ford pickup truck, not a police cruiser, slowed down and turned into my driveway. Sheriff Walt Hensley was behind the wheel, but he wasn't wearing his uniform or his Stetson. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, looking less like the law and more like a grandfather. Next to him was Carol, the real estate agent who had sold me this hopeless property. Walt stepped out of the truck, carrying a cooler with both hands. "Afternoon, Paula," he called out, his voice relaxed. "I brought the hydration, local craft brew from Big Sky. Figured we needed something better than station coffee to celebrate." Carol hopped out the other side, balancing a foil-covered dish. "And I brought the apple pie," she announced. "Homemade, not store-bought. Don't insult me by asking." I wiped my paint-stained hands on a rag and walked over to meet them. "You guys didn't have to do this," I said, though I was smiling. A real smile, one that reached my eyes. Walt set the cooler down on the newly repaired porch steps and looked me up and down. He wasn't scanning for weapons or assessing threats. He was just looking at a friend. "You look good, Paula," he said. "Different. The last time I saw you, you looked like you were waiting for a bomb to go off. You don't have that look anymore." "I don't feel like that anymore," I admitted, looking out over the valley where the wildflowers were starting to push through the soil. "I realized I don't have to stand guard 24 hours a day. The war is over. I'm just living now." We moved to the back porch, setting up a makeshift dining table on a couple of sawhorses covered with a tablecloth. We carved the ham, the meat falling off the bone, passed around mashed potatoes and green bean casserole, and cracked open the cold beers. Ideally, a family gathering is supposed to be about blood relatives sharing history. But as we sat there, a retired sheriff, a real estate agent, and a recovering soldier, I realized that family isn't about whose DNA you share. It's about who respects your boundaries. It's about who shows up with a pie instead of a demand letter. This was my chosen family, and the food tasted better than any meal I'd ever eaten at Frank Poole's table. Midway through the meal, my phone buzzed on the railing. The vibration made a harsh sound against the wood. I glanced at the screen. It was an unfamiliar number with a Colorado area code. The conversation stopped. Walt looked at the phone, then at me. He knew. I knew who it was. It was Frank. He was calling from the court-ordered care facility where he was serving his probation. He had probably used his allotted phone time to call me, maybe to apologize, maybe to guilt-trip me, maybe just to see if he still had any power left to disrupt my day. 4 months ago, seeing that area code would have sent me into a panic attack. I would have grabbed my gun. My heart would have raced. I would have felt that crushing weight of obligation and fear. But today, I looked at the screen and felt nothing. No anger, no fear, no pity. Just a profound, quiet indifference. He was a ghost from a story I'd finished reading. I didn't decline the call. I didn't block it. I simply reached out, flipped the phone face down on the wood, and picked up my beer. "Everything okay?" Carol asked gently. "Everything is perfect," I said. "Just a telemarketer." The buzzing stopped. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was liberated. I didn't need his apology to heal. I didn't need to forgive him to his face to be the bigger person. My silence was the answer. It was the loudest thing I could ever say to him. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, I stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. I looked out at the 40 acres of timber and rock that belonged to me, free and clear. No mortgage, no co-signers, no strings attached. "You know," I said, gesturing toward the rolling hill on the west side of the property. "I've been thinking about that ridge over there." "Thinking about selling it?" Walt asked, taking a sip of his beer. "No," I said. "I'm thinking about building, not a big house, maybe 4 or 5 tiny homes. Simple, efficient, self-sustaining." Carol raised an eyebrow. "Rental units? Airbnb?" "Sanctuaries," I corrected. "There are a lot of female veterans coming back from deployment right now who don't have anywhere to go. They're stuck in the system, dealing with trauma, dealing with families who don't understand them. They need a place to decompress, a place where they can feel safe until they figure out their next move." I turned back to them, the idea taking root in my heart as I spoke. "I want to start a nonprofit, the Fortress Project. I want to give them what I found here. I want to help them build their own fortresses." Walt smiled, a slow, proud grin spreading across his face. He raised his bottle. "To the Fortress Project." "To the Fortress," Carol echoed, raising her glass. I raised mine, the amber liquid catching the last light of the day. "To resurrection," I whispered. I took a sip, the taste of hops and citrus sharp on my tongue. I looked at my hands. They were stained with white paint and calloused from hard work, but they were steady. "My name is Paula Poole. I am a soldier. I am a survivor. And standing here on this mountain, surrounded by people who respect me, breathing the air of a spring I fought to see, I finally knew exactly who I was. This was my land. This was my life. And I was finally, truly free." This journey taught me that family isn't defined by a birth certificate, it is defined by respect. Many of us, especially those with giving hearts, are raised to believe that love means enduring abuse or setting ourselves on fire to keep others warm. That is a lie. True love respects boundaries. The most valuable lesson I learned on Poole Ridge is that you cannot save others until you secure your own foundation. Building a fortress isn't about shutting the world out. It's about creating a safe space where your true self can finally grow. Your peace is worth fighting for. Now, I want to hear from you. We all have a Frank or an Evan in our lives, someone who tests our limits. Have you ever had to make the hard choice to cut ties to save your own sanity? Or are you still looking for the courage to lay the first stone of your own fortress? Please share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be the exact encouragement someone else needs to read today. And if this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let's build this community together.